it is so difficult to choose only one important thing that was told to me from the world beyond during regression therapy, because I do really think that when you are under this kind of therapy, either as a therapist or as a client, everything is extremely fascinating. Because I think that you are, to some extent, like a person trying to peek behind the curtains in order to see what's on the stage or even behind the stage, to discover the secrets that make up the whole performance. So to some extent, I think that when you are under regression, you feel like having the privilege, the extraordinary chance to understand the great truths and the great, let's say, mysteries that lay behind a human life, that lay behind the human soul, that lay in the world beyond us. Because when you enter in the subconscious mind, and when you reach, let's say, the realms of higher vibration by the specific means of this particular therapy, you start perceiving things from a completely different perspective, a far more profound perspective than you do usually have when you use simply your conscious mind on a daily basis. So there is such a great amount of fascinating things that I have discovered, that I have understood, or that were told to me. But if I were to choose only one or two important things, I think that first of all I would choose one experience that I had as a therapist. This happened, I think, 2 years and a half ago, when I was working with a friend of mine who is a very profound spiritual being, and I was working on a past life of hers when she was living somewhere between the medieval ages and Renaissance in France. She was a woman, but she was a very open-minded, extremely intelligent and, let's say, revolutionary being, because she was conceiving quite complex projects of engineering, as we would name it today. She was conceiving bridges and structures holding buildings and so on, and it was something very unusual for that particular period of time. But unfortunately, her personal life was a very difficult one. She had a lot of traumas, and the death itself was a big trauma, and this is why we reached this past life from out of her inner need to solve a feeling of helplessness, a feeling of frustration, of a feeling of seeing herself as not being valuable at all as a human being. And the death itself, as I have just mentioned, was a trauma itself, because she was killed almost by accident by a man who was part of her extended family, let's say, who was an important part of her life, who participated in most of the important steps of her life, and in the end they have a very strong conflict, and he killed her. And when we reached the second part of regression therapy, so after exploring, navigating a life, we do start the healing itself. And during this healing process, we reached a point when she accessed her higher self, when we brought her spiritual guide, when we started releasing all the feelings and the words that were unsaid and were unexpressed and so on. And all of a sudden, when she connected to the higher beings that were around us, she told me, listen, it's something very interesting that I do feel right now. And she told me that the man who killed her was an extension of her own higher self. So, trying to understand this extremely stunning truth, speaking with the other higher beings who were supporting us in that particular process, we both understood that her spiritual higher self took this decision to split in two, in the same life, in two parallel bodies. Of course that she was not conscious at all during that life that she was living in two different bodies at the same time. But for her soul lessons to be deeply learned and understood, her higher self decided that a greater evolution was to be acquired exactly in this way, by trying to see the same situation from two different and even opposite perspectives. And so she took this decision to play in the same time the role of the victim and the role of the perpetrator. I must say that it was, even for myself, quite difficult to digest at that moment, to accept this truth, because in any spiritual path, and I think that in any therapy, if we are really honest with ourselves, we learn each day new fascinating truths. So I can never say that I know everything. It's an ongoing process of evolution and of learning for myself. I can never say that I'm completely sure of something and I can't boast that I know everything. So I try to be as open-minded and as flexible as possible, and to accept everything that is sent to me from above, and to try slowly and step by step to accept everything. And I must say that I was completely astonished. And then afterwards I discovered in some books that I read, written by different authors from around the world, from other colleagues who are also regression therapists and who don't know me, so I have never met them face to face, I have discovered similar stories. So there are other colleagues of mine who have also discovered in their own case studies that there are a lot of situations in which a spirit decides to split in more bodies and to live parallel lives. Of course that most frequently when we do decide to split for living parallel lives, and I will dedicate a whole episode of our podcast specifically to this topic of parallel lives, generally speaking, we do not meet with ourselves. This was an exception. I mean, generally we do not share the same family, the same context, the same country, the same, let's say, physical space. But this was a particular case, and probably there were two things very important that I understood at that very moment. One of them is that our Father has an infinite imagination, and he allows any means of learning possible if he thinks that it is useful for our spirit. So if he considers that a certain experience might make us evolve faster, he will accept incredibly intricate, complicated, complex scripts, life stories. So this was one conclusion. Another conclusion, maybe even deeper than the first one, is that Shakespeare was indeed, maybe without knowing it, he was indeed very clear in his mind when he stated that all world is a stage and all men and women are merely players. Because yes, indeed, I do think that our lives are to some extent roles played here on Earth, on this stage that is our planet. So taking into account this example that I have just offered to you with the person who was the victim and the perpetrator in the same time, I think that it should be very helpful for the spiritual beings to try to detach from time to time from their roles. It would be great if we would not take any emotion and any situation that is happening to us so personally, because this leads to a lot of emotionally problems and to emotional problems and to a great inner burden, and moreover it leads to conflicts. We see all the times, unfortunately, that there are still so many wars on earth. There are so many conflicts within a family, within friends, etc. So I think that if we would manage to stop a few minutes, to breathe deeply, and to detach at least a bit from the role we do interpret here, and if we would try to have the higher perspective of our higher self, we would see the things in a different light. We would be more flexible, more open-minded, more able to understand, and eventually to forgive. And this would bring us much more inner peace and happiness. So I think this was one of the most fascinating experiences I have had with regression therapy. But if I were to answer your question, speaking about what were the most important things I have understood during these last 10 years, I think that the fact that each time I do connect with the other realms, as a therapist or as a client, there is at least someone, if not more, spiritual beings that help you, that are there for you and for the client. Implicitly transmits us the idea that we are not alone. And this should be very helpful and very important for all of us. Moreover, something very touching is that before closing each session, I do have this habit of asking both the client and the spiritual beings that helped us during the whole session, is there something else you would like to ask, to know, or to simply say? And the client sometimes says yes or no, and he or she asks different kind of questions. But from the other realms, the divine or the spiritual guides that helped us always tell me in the end the same thing. Yes, we do have something to add, that I or that we love you, and that we love you very much. And I think that probably even more important that what we do acquire as pieces of information from regression therapy, what we do acquire as knowledge, probably the most important thing that is that we are not alone and that we are so loved.